Mr. Wilson, do you know if we have all of the commissioners on? My screen is not clear if everyone's joined.
Thanks, Chair. It does appear as though they're all back online. Thank you, Chair.
If commissioners are ready, then perhaps what I'd like to do is see if there are any questions concerning Dr. Stewart's presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. Again, a great presentation. Lots of information there. Back in slide 16, we looked at, this is in regards to 2B and the survey versus commercial. There's a large uptick in the commercial WPUE. And we had a number of falls, and as we discussed in other meetings, we felt that some of that may have been to restrictive yellow eye provisions, not a lot of quota. And since then, the TACs for yellow eye have come back. Would that correspond to what you're seeing? From the 2B commercial WPUE?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, so I've actually done some research in collaboration with Dr. Robin Forrest at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, looking at the response of the Canadian fishery to increasingly tight yellow eye restrictions. And we did, in fact, find evidence that over that time period from 2017 to 2020, the fishery was making shifts in its spatial distribution to avoid those places that were the areas of highest encounter rates for yellow eye rockfish. So that analysis concluded it with the 2020 data. So I'm not sure what the effect would be on the 2021 observations, but I can say that we did document some response in the fishery leading up to that time period.
Just one last question, and it's regards to slide 27. And something, I think it's 27, it may be 26. And it's regards to the 212 cohort. So it's probably 27, yeah. Yeah. And you were mentioning that this is dependent, that the fish mature, the spawning biomass is, if they mature in this at this rate, this modeled rate, I guess. Just in regards to, there is some other discussion around size limits, and just curious what your thoughts would be if we start harvesting some of these cohorts prior to them becoming mature, because maybe it's I'm not sure if it would affect the spawning biomass going forward if we're harvesting more of those fish earlier before they become mature, and how that would affect things into the future. Sorry for that convoluted question, but I hope I get you understand where I'm getting at.
Thank you. And I think you've illustrated a good point in the trade-offs associated with the potential for use or not of a minimum size limit. You've correctly identified that harvesting female halibut earlier will reduce their lifetime reproductive output, and therefore there will be a cost to potentially reducing or eliminating the minimum size limit in the function of accessing those females earlier. What we found in the most recent analysis, however, was that that trade-off was more than offset by the additional gains associated with harvesting more male halibut, as well as harvesting these fish closer to their peak yield per recruit, or the location in their life at which their individual growth is perfectly offset by their natural mortality rates. So it's certainly a consideration, and I think that the effect of size limits on large incoming cohorts and therefore on the fishery is something that is appropriate to test via the management strategy evaluation. And I think that's why we moved from consideration of size limits in terms of very short-term tactical metrics to trying to better understand how size limits might play out over a longer time horizon and in a more strategic sense. I think that's where
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, and thanks again.
For wanting to evaluate.
Thanks again for your presentation, and that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Stewart, for the presentation. I had a few questions, so hopefully you'll humor me with them. The first was, I was thinking a little bit more about, I think you made a comment early in the presentation about that we do include the commercial fishery catch rate as an index of abundance. And I know you know about the limitations of sort of deriving an understanding of stock abundance from the commercial fishery data. And so I just wondered if you could tell me a little more about sort of the rationale for including it and how we kind of manage for the limitations associated with that index as an indicator of abundance.
Yes, I can speak to that, and thanks for the opportunity to get back to that topic. As I mentioned, we do fit the commercial catch per unit effort index in the stock assessment, but unlike the modeled FIS index, we do need to take into consideration that the fishery is not fully standardized every year, that technology changes, gear changes, and many other things shift over time. And so the way that we treat this in the model is twofold. One, when there are points in the time series that we know corresponded to major changes in fishery activity, whether that was a wholesale shift in a fishery into a new area. I'm talking about much farther back in the historical period, back in the mid-1900s, or whether that's something like gear technology, for example, the shift from J hooks to circle hooks in 1983 and 1984. Big events like that, we model those with an unrestricted change in catchability in that year. So we basically allow the proportionality of the index to the population to change in an unconstrained way in that year, basically creating a whole new time series when we have an event like that. Then the second way we do this is to estimate the degree of change in both catchability and selectivity over time. So essentially we allow for methods and technology and fishing behavior to change over time in a constrained manner. In a technical sense, we treat this as a random walk in the stock assessment model, and we iteratively solve for the degree of change over time that's most consistent with the trends that we see. So at the end of the day, what this means is that we're not able to draw as much information from the commercial time series as we are from the FIS time series. But it does allow us, particularly in those historical years when we don't have a consistent survey trend, it does allow us to still draw some information about what was happening with the population in that time period. So it's better than no information at all, but it certainly carries less weight in the model in recent years than the Fishery Independent Setline Survey.
My other question was about the addition of a biosocioeconomic indicator, and I had a couple thoughts on this. One was I scanned the paper associated with that, and my sense is that it is actually specific to the commercial fishery. So just wondering if I'm correct in that, given the information that's included about the costs and sort of the price information, which would not really be relevant to recreational or food social ceremonial slash subsistence fisheries. And then I wondered also about how this, whether there are examples elsewhere of how information like this has been used. I mean, we're looking for information to support decisions, and so I'm curious about whether that kind of indicator has been used in other fisheries management contexts, particularly given that so many of those factors are sort of outside our control. The costs that fishers encounter, the price they get for their catch. So just wondered if there was more information, how information like this could be used.
I'll defer to Dr. Hudsonzak on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis, for this question. Speaking to the first part of the question, yes, the current index mostly reflects the commercial fishery because it includes the ex-vessel price. That would be a big motivator for the commercial fishery. But we're currently in discussions how to evaluate separately the index also for the recreational fishery, noting that there are other components that are more important to recreational fisheries, but some of the components that are included currently in the index would be also relevant to recreational fisheries. And these are related to the fuel price that would be representing the fluctuation in potential cost to the recreational fisheries operators, or the labor cost that would be also relevant, as well as these biological conditions that are driving both fisheries, noting though that this would be impacting these two fisheries differently, because while the commercial fishery might be mostly motivated by the weight, the size of the fish is an important component for the recreational fishery as well. So this is something we're currently discussing, and we hope to bring some more refinement and some more additional details to this component of the stock assessment that is presented by Ian. On the second part, the similar index has been used before and presented before in the context of tuna fisheries. The Western Pacific tuna fishery is using this type of indication just to and it is used to inform management, just to indicate the trends in the past and see the direction of how the fishery is performing in terms of different components that are related to profitability, noting that this relative measure is not absolute profitability, but reflects those relative changes that are important to the sector. Thank you.
Yes, I guess my first question is directed to Dr. Stewart. I'm trying to get a better understanding about, your the stock biomass shifting to region 3, which in your presentation was mostly due to the appearance of this 2012 younger class of fish. I assume that feeds into the stock assessment, and eventually is contributes to the distribution of the TCEY. So how is this a younger fish? I mean, obviously the TCEY has something to do with, the harvestable O32 fish. So is that, so I'm not quite sure how this younger fish, which may not be of harvestable size, some may be, but it might be a small percentage of this 9-year-old class that is harvestable. And how is that fed into the model to distribute the TCEY that, we see in your decision table increases in basically all of region 3? I just need a better understanding of that. How is this young fish being treated in the TCEY distribution?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I can definitely speak to that. So we have two estimates of stock distribution that we evaluate. What's shown on slide 12 here is the all sizes distribution. So this includes everything that was caught by the FIS survey in 2021 and in earlier years. And so in this way, this provides the best indication of what's going on for the entire range of sizes and ages that we are able to sample with that tool. When we get to the application of the interim management procedure, that procedure, as it's been applied in the past, very specifically limits the calculation to just the percent of biomass that's associated with O32 fish. So when it comes to distributing the TCEY, that calculation only includes that component which would already be available to the directed fisheries, particularly the directed commercial fishery with the 32-inch minimum size limit. And so the figure here will differ slightly from the percentages that are produced later in this presentation for the interim management procedure, in that this is all sizes, and in that case, it's just the O32
Thank you.
component.
That helps me understand that. I guess my second question would be to Dr. Bashia. Regarding the economic, socioeconomic input into the stock assessment, to me, the stock assessment is pretty much all biological. So this new input, is that eventually going to trickle into like even a TCEY distribution, or how is this socioeconomic element going to be treated in the stock assessment? What's its role and place?
Thank you, Commissioner Yamada, for this question. So main motivation for bringing this index to the discussion about stock assessment is to provide additional details about the motivations within the fisheries. So here we can see that through the index, this index describes in a way the level of motivation and the level of potential opportunities within the sectors. This can help us understand over time what is motivating the catches and how this could be driving the components such as effort, the final catch, and so on. With regards how this could be incorporated directly into the stock assessment versus being provided as additional piece of information, that is something that would have to be discussed further.
That's all the questions I have.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I guess my question or an observation on the social and economic index. So as Neil said, I also went back and took a look at the paper and the 4 indicators of fish price and fishing cost as represented by labor and fuel, and the fourth one being the stock condition as represented by FCEY. And the paper noted that the index is in 2021 is 37% greater than 2020, and then 23% greater than the most recent 10-year average. And then I was thinking, well, okay, so what does that tell me about any decisions that I would make as far as management of the resource? And I guess I still struggle with that question of how it helps me inform me, whereas when I look at the other indicators, I have a pretty clear understanding of how they would help me. So I guess my question is, it would be useful if there was an example of how this social and economic index would be useful for us as managers of this resource to better inform our decision making. And if there's some example that would help us, that would be, I think, really critical to see if we want to continue with this or modify it. And so maybe, is there an existing example that you could point us to that would help us understand how we could use this going forward in making decisions for the halibut resource?
Thank you for this question, Commissioner Ryle. So one example we could bring here, at this time we present this index here as a coastwide index as well as index per region. And again, this index would in a way describe the motivations with the fisheries. So one example could be, for example, if the conditions of the fisheries were drastically deteriorating, you could expect, for example, the underfishing of the quota in a given region if there's a big variation in the conditions that are prevalent in one region versus others. So that would be one example in which this index could be used specifically in management. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I'll have to think about this some more. But right now, I guess I still struggle to see its applicability. That's all the questions I had, Glenn.
Go back to slide 27 that Peter was talking about. And I just wanted to clarify that when you're referring to cohorts, you're not talking about just spawners. You're talking about male and female that would recruit, that would make up that 56% or the 19%?
Thank you, Commissioner. I've probably been a bit varied in the way I've used the term cohort. So in most of the presentation, I was referring to all of the fish born in a particular year. In this particular slide, we are most focused on females. We track the female spawning biomass. So this includes only those fish, only female Pacific halibut.
So, well, that might be not the right one, but the question I had there is, I remember a year or two ago, the commission thought that there was a 2011 year class. And so I was just wondering, is that still showing in the survey, or is it not quite as strong as originally thought a couple of years ago?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. In fact, you're correct. Initially we did see two potential year classes coming, both 2011 and 2012. And as we got increasing years of data, the signal has shifted and is now pretty clearly in favor of just a 2012 year class. So I think that as you know, as we've watched these year classes come in over the last 2 to 3 stock assessments, I've tried to highlight how uncertain we are when these fish are very, very young. And now that these fish are 9+ years old, I think we have a much better read on them than we did when they were
One
just
last
first starting
question.
to enter
That 9 years
both the
of
fishery
entering
and
the
fish
fishery,
data streams.
has that changed over the last 20 years because of the size of age? I would think it would, but has it typically been 9 years all the time, or is it less than that sometimes?
Well, actually, both yes and no. So historically, the fishery has caught the majority of its fish between 8 and 16 years old. And by historically, I mean all the way back into the early 1900s. So in that regard, the age distribution in the catch has actually been incredibly stable over the last 100 years. However, there have been some changes associated with size at age, and I don't have a figure that illustrates this well, but when we put the minimum size limit in place, we definitely saw a shift where we lost most of the 5, 6, and 7-year-olds from the commercial catch that had been in there prior to the mid 70s. In recent years, you can actually see in this figure here that we have a few 5-year-olds that have shown up in the catch, and then we have a period from 2007 through about 2015 where we have no 5-year-olds and no 6-year-olds. And just in the last few years, we're starting to see those 6-year-olds again. And in fact, in 2021, we saw a few 5-year-olds as well. And I think that is reflective of this change in size at age that we're starting to see, particularly for the younger age classes.
Directed discard mortality. And I note there's a fairly substantial decrease, not only in 2021 but also in 2020. And I know in our fishery in British Columbia, there was no observer coverage. Was that the same situation in particular? It looks like 3A and 4C, D, and E. Were they allowed to have observers on board?
I think I will defer to somebody from the U.S. delegation who's probably far more familiar with the timing of specific events during 2020 than I am.
Our full coverage requirements in either 2020 or 2021. That full coverage fleet includes vessels that are active in our various catch share programs, and in particular for the Gulf of Alaska, that includes the trawl catcher processor fleet, and then trawl catcher vessels that are participating in our rockfish program. In the Bering Sea, that includes the vast preponderance of the vessels that are active in those fisheries. We, in 2020, also have a portion of the fleet, and in 2021, have a portion of the fleet that's subject to the partial coverage requirements. Within the partial coverage requirements, there were a variety of different ways that we addressed observer coverage. They differed depending upon whether a vessel was in the trawl, what we call stratum, subject to coverage under that if they were trawl vessels, versus fixed gear vessels. For fixed gear vessels, there was without getting into a lot of detail, more flexibility in terms of how observer coverage requirements were applied, particularly in 2020. For 2021, there were a series of different approaches that we used for the trawl fleet, but generally speaking, had more expansive coverage than existed for the fixed gear fleet. Those same provisions did not carry over into 2021, so we were able to deploy coverage within our fleet in 2021 as well in that partial coverage category. I think that answers your question. And just in terms of why we saw such a marked decrease in discard mortality, it has, I think, very little to do with the observer coverage and more to do with the fact that there simply was not a lot of fishing in a number of fisheries that traditionally have relatively high halibut bycatch. And that's, I think, particularly true in the Gulf of Alaska, where there were substantial reductions in a number of the flatfish fisheries that were being harvested. And I believe Dr. Stewart had mentioned that was due to a range of factors that included market conditions and other closures that were applicable to that fleet for a portion of the year. Not seeing questions from other commissioners. I did have one, Dr. Stewart, if I may, on slide 63. Yeah, thank you. I guess my question was, could you refresh my memory in terms of the areas of the stock? So my recollection was that there was some new information to suggest that perhaps the overall productivity that we observed in, I think in particular areas 3B, 4A, and 4C, D, and E may be closer to or on par with the productivity that we were seeing in the more easterly areas. And my recollection as well was that perhaps there was less productivity that is indicated by our harvest rate policy, which is currently in place for area 4B. Is that generally correct about the current understanding of productivity?
I think I'll defer this question to Dr. Hicks, who's done the most recent work on productivity.
Thanks, Commissioner Merrill. You are correct. There has been some work that has been done investigating productivity in all of the IPHC regulatory areas. That was about 2 years ago, I think, that we did that work. And to give you a little bit of history on this, there was, before Dr. Stewart and I came to IPHC, there was an understanding that the western areas were slightly less productive potentially than eastern areas. But there were also other reasons that the harvest policy included measures to reduce the fishing intensity in those western areas. Part of that reason was due to less understanding of the stock out there, more paucity in data. And over the time, we've sampled a lot more out there. There's been more data coming from those areas. So we've partially solved that problem. Understanding productivity is not easy to do between these different areas, but analysis I did, or that we did for the MSAB a couple of years ago, indicated that potentially productivity has changed and those areas have become more productive and more on par with the eastern areas. All of them except for 4B, which still seem to be quite different and less productive than all the other IPHC regulatory areas. One proposal is to investigate those or that part of the management procedure and the MSE process and investigate those relative harvest rates. We started doing that some and reported those results at the last annual meeting, but not any other work has been done since then. So even though there's indications that productivity may have changed in those western areas, I'm sorry, I cannot say there's any more recent work than that to indicate anything now. Yes, making those, or changing the relative harvest rates in those western areas would have an effect not only on the TCY in the coming year, but could also have some effects down the line. You know, and that's where the MSE comes in and is very useful, is it can investigate the long-term effects of changing those harvest rates in those areas to determine if there's downstream effects, as it has been called.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks and Dr. Stewart. One more follow-up question, if I may. I think if you could, oops, sorry, I just lost my place. Advance to slide 66. And my question is,
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
so if I may, so for this year where we saw reductions in the bycatch limit so that it was below average, there's some, if you will, precaution built into these TCEY estimates because we are assuming that 3-year average.
Yes, there's the 3-year average doesn't show as large a drop as the estimate for 2021. Although I would note that over the last few years, as we've applied this, we have seen some years when the average has been below the most recent year as well. So I'm not sure, projecting forward, whether that is necessarily precautionary or not.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Commissioner Davis.
Anyway, I was thinking about hook competition factors, and I know that in some areas they can have a fairly significant influence on how survey indices are adjusted. And I wondered if there is a synopsis somewhere that sort of outlines what that has looked like over time, and also maybe summarizes what we have heard from the SRB about how we apply these adjustments, and sort of whether there are analogs used in other fisheries. It's a dimension of our assessment that I'm hoping I could develop a better understanding of, and so wondered if staff could point me to documents, or if there was a follow-up that might help me with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. Yes, as far as documents go, we've documented the hook competition standardization very recently for the Scientific Review Board meeting in September, and yesterday for the documents accompanying the Research Advisory Board meeting. So I don't have the document numbers in front of me right now, but if you go to the website and look up the list of documents for those two meetings, you'll find documents with titles like Survey and Commercial Data Analysis with my name attached to them. And there is a summary of the purpose and the method for the hook competition standardization. And those documents also include references to another group of scientists who developed basically an identical standardization in parallel to Bill Clark and us back in around 2008, I think, 2009. So those are scientists who have also been using that. I believe that was applied to rockfish in BC at the time. There has been some more recent work using similar standardizations. I'm not sure if it's been published or not, but I'm aware of at least one other manuscript that has used the same method as well. And there are probably similar methods out there that people have attempted to use that I'm unaware of. So I can perhaps, as you suggest, offline provide references to at least the work that was done in parallel to ours, but that reference is also in the documents to the SRB and the RAB, and I'm happy to provide references to those documents if you need direct references. Apologize, there was another part to your question. In terms of tracking the changes in the hook competition standardization adjustments over time, I believe that information is included on our interactive on the website. So you should be able to see how those adjustments have varied, at least on average, from one area to another over time.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, we have 4, so I'll just ask the Secretariat to move those up onto the screen, please. Just take a moment while that's transferring. Just confirming, Secretariat, that that's being transferred across to the screen. One of those electronic meeting glitches that we're living with at the moment. So there is a total of 4 public comments or questions that we've received to date. The first is from Don Lane, a question regarding agenda item 5.1, the IPHC Fishery Independent Setline Survey. And the question is, please explain the term predicted catch in the survey compared to actual catch in the survey. How is the predicted catch calculated? And I'll pass to Kayla to respond.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. The predicted catch is based on the catch from each station the last time it was fished. So ultimately, the predicted catch is the same information that's provided in the station projection tables that are also provided in tender specifications. For example, in the 2A stations, the majority of that catch information would have been from 2019, the last time those stations would have possibly been fished.
Great, thank you very much. The next is a public comment, also from Don Lane from the FV Predator. also on 5.1, the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. And so I'm going to read this, but please do read along yourself. The topic: I have concerns that the design and approval of the Fishery Independent Setline Survey has been moving earlier in the calendar year over the past couple of years. The design presentation leaves little time for commissioners and public to weigh in, comment, and modify. Staff is releasing bid specs in December, with bids due by the end of January following year. This leaves little time for commissioners to process and modify design to accommodate public concerns. Predator has been doing IPHC surveys since 2006, and I have sat in commissioner's seat as well. My ideal balance is proposed design specs presented to commissioners at IM, final design approved at annual meeting, bid specs released soon after, and bids end due end of February. It is common knowledge that further you are from target, the more difficult it is to hit. There is tremendous amount of uncertainty and implementation induced into the FIS process by the current timeline. The next question is on agenda item 5.4, and the question is: can the IPHC differentiate Pacific halibut target from mixed sablefish halibut trips in logbook data from the commercial fishery? That could influence size. Thank you. And it's down for Dr. Stewart. Thank you.
Yes, and thanks, Dr. Wilson. I can't answer that one. We do, in fact, categorize every set as to its target, whether that's Pacific halibut, mixed, or just sablefish. And I probably should have prefaced my presentation earlier with this. The time series that I was presenting for commercial fishery catch rates is limited to only those sets that are halibut target. So we do recognize that in some places and at some times there is an increasing fraction of mixed fishing effort, and those are not included in the annual trends that you see there. Mainly because it's not clear exactly how to standardize effectively for trips that are not targeting just Pacific halibut. Sorry, not trips, sets that are not just targeting Pacific halibut.
Great, thank you very much. And then the final question is from Ray Malavidov, the CBSFA, again for agenda item 5.4. Since just over half of the 4 CDE setline survey stations, 75 out of 140, were successfully surveyed in 2021, how has that impacted the overall survey results for this area? And so maybe Dr. Stewart and Dr. Webster would like to support. Cheers.
So thank you for the question. So by not sampling the southern portion of 4 CDE in 2021, that would have introduced some additional uncertainty into the estimates for 4 CDE, but noting that those estimates are still relatively precise because the bulk of the data comes from the NIMS Troll survey, which is calibrated with surveys from the FIS when they overlapped in 2006 and 2015. So while that had an impact on precision, it means that that overall that impact is very small. There is a possibility that there's something going on in that area that we didn't see, changes in distribution or trend, and that's always a risk when we don't sample a particular part of the habitat. But it is a relatively modest proportion of the biomass in 4 CDE, so we don't expect that to have had a meaningful, in terms of management, a significant impact. And we do note that that area was last sampled in 2019 and is planned again to be sampled in 2022, that part of 4 CDE.
Great, and that ends the comments and questions we have, Chair.
But back on the question that Don Lane presented, or the comment he presented about moving the final time to, I think he said February. Do the commission staff meet with the 13 vessel owners? I noticed we had 13 boats in the surveys last year, and go through this type of logistics, and have we heard other requests of this nature?
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair, I will pass to Kayla to respond to how the debriefings go at the conclusion of each of the setline survey seasons, and then also to talk a little bit about the plan for the upcoming annual meeting to have the standard informational session as well. So I'll pass to Kayla.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I ultimately have not heard any other feedback of this nature from other vessels. Generally speaking, the vessels that regularly participate in the FIS appreciate getting their bids accepted in vessels contracted earlier on. It allows for their own planning outside of the survey to take place earlier on in the season. They can arrange for their own personal fishing arrangements and whatnot. And it also allows for me and my team and the commission as a whole to make other plans for the survey in a more timely manner. And also allow for all field staff to be assigned appropriately in a more efficient manner. I do speak regularly with the captains that participate in the
Okay, thank you very much.
And I did not hear any complaints as far as when the tender specifications are announced. Thank you.
This is for you, Dave. Back to Don Lane's second comment. I didn't really hear a reply back to the questions that he posed within his rather lengthy comment.
Sure, thank you. Through the chair, I guess it was mainly because it was considered just a general comment, not that there was questions in there. Let me just go back to it. And this is the point that we held quite a substantive discussion on, both at the last interim meeting and then also the commission meeting. We walked through the timing of the bids and the decision-making process by the commission. We also talked substantially about the consultation process and how to continually enhance that. Dr. Webster put up a slide during his presentation with the year-long consultation process and then also the 3-year planning process that we now have in place for the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. Now that the expansion series and experiment has been completed, it is allowing us to plan further ahead and tentatively approve designs 3 years out, which then allows the commission on an annual basis to, as has been indicated here or suggested here, potentially modify the next year's survey at the interim meeting and then also the annual meeting itself, and for those modifications to be incorporated into the final design. And so that's what we went through this past year. It seemed to work very well. The commission tentatively approved the design, endorsed the design. We put out the bid specs. The commission then had another opportunity at the annual meeting to make additional modifications, which would have been incorporated based on the tender specifications without difficulty. I think that's all I have. I think Kayla has one more thing. Kayla?
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I also wanted to note that posting the tender specifications prior to the annual meeting allows interested parties to review said tender specifications, and then we do have a informal discussion with all interested parties generally during the annual meeting time. That allows them to ask questions regarding that given year's tender specifications, and waiting until after the annual meeting would then eliminate that that discussion opportunity. And I think particularly last year in 2021, where we weren't able to meet in person, it really was beneficial to both IPHC staff as well as those interested in bidding. So,
Yeah,
thank you.
thanks for that, Dr. Wilson and Kayla, for providing that additional information. I think that's helpful. Glenn, I don't know if this is the time to go back to the fish survey presentation that Dr. Webster provided us earlier this morning. We as commissioner are being asked to provide direction on a recommendation between option 1 and 2. And I had a question then about providing some additional information around an example of what's the benefit of option 1 over option 2. And so I guess just to further to that, maybe it'd be good to talk about it now, or maybe to have Dr. Webster provide us something in writing. But I guess one of the questions I have is, so what would be the added cost to increasing the number of stations? I think it's 157 stations. And so what's the benefit that we get from that additional cost in terms of improving the understanding of the stock? And I guess it's basically 4C, D, and E. So do we get increased accuracy or precision around the estimates, and to what level? So I don't know if Dr. Webster wants to answer that now, Glenn, or maybe he can come back to us with something written that would be helpful for us to make a decision.
Perhaps I'll suggest this. Morning tomorrow, if that works for you.
Yeah, thanks,
Paul,
Glenn.
as well
Certainly
as,
would work
Dr.
for me.
Webster.
Yeah.
Just to chime in there, Chair, we do also have the slide that was requested earlier in terms of what those two designs look like in terms of the number of stations and also the cost implication. There's only one slide, and Dr. Stewart could talk to that very briefly, maybe sort of to set the scene for the discussion you're talking about tomorrow morning, if that's acceptable, Chair.
Dr. Wilson, Dr. Webster, please.
Go ahead.
Thanks. This is Ian again. We did want to follow up from the question earlier on today and really to highlight the difference between the two designs. Maybe I'll preface this by saying, why is the staff recommending design number 1? Design number 1, the major difference is that it includes 100% sampling in 4C, D, and E. And as Dr. Webster noted in his presentation, Area 4C, D, and E has been a highly dynamic environment over the last several years. We've seen evidence of the stock drifting northward, and this is the one place where our stock intersects with the boundary of the convention area. So we have a stock distribution that is potentially drifting toward an international boundary beyond which we have very little information. And so as part of our longer term research plan, we want to better understand the dynamics at and potentially across the border with Russian waters, as well as to be able to track the population trends as well as possible in the Bering Sea, noting that it is currently the most dynamic part of the stock distribution. We had this discussion with our scientific review board, and you'll note from their report that they were also supportive of additional sampling in the Bering Sea, noting that we don't require this to meet our minimum bias and maximum variance targets, but that it is potentially very timely and forward-looking to be considering enhancing our sampling in the Bering Sea at this juncture. So with that as the backdrop, what you see on the slide before you are just a few details from the design projection that we did to arrive at, or to highlight the difference between these two designs. The section at the top highlights the components of the design projection that are in common for the two. So for both of these projections, we've assumed the stock trend will be down by 5% from 2021 to 2022, and we've assumed that the price will decrease by 2.5% for a coast-wide average of approximately $6.47 per pound. I will note that we routinely provide and look at a sensitivity table that illustrates, if the stock actually were to go up a little or the price were to go up a little bit. And what we routinely find is that that table across a reasonable range of stock and price trends tends to reflect on the order of $600,000 to $1 million difference across these axes. With what are relatively minor and essentially very difficult to predict differences in those two trends. So we have tried to pick something that is a reasonable projection for 2022. Importantly, for both of these designs, the net revenue projection is negative 200,000. And that reflects two things. The first is we ran a small surplus in 2021, and this is an effort to balance this over the medium term. So we have the ability to pull some of that revenue from 2021 into the 2022 design, which reduces our overall footprint. In that fashion, Design 1 includes 100 sampling in 4 CD&E and 1,188 stations, noting that even with 100% sampling, we are still at or slightly below the historical average footprint for the survey, and this is because of the rationalization and the fact that we can create a more efficient design. Design 2 reduces the sampling in 4 CD&E to only 38% of those stations, those that were shown in the figure earlier on the lower 4D edge primarily. This reduces the overall design to 1,031 stations. Now, the reduction in overall stations is greater than just the stations in 4 CD&E, because as we remove those stations in 4 CD&E, we can actually reduce the density in some other areas in order to maintain that net negative 200K. So really the choice that the Commission had in front of it, and the reason why the Secretariat put forward Design 1, is that it provides better information at the same net revenue. I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Well, that's correct. Thank you, Chair. So agenda item 6 and 6.1, which will be presented by Dr. Planas. So if you could have the presentation for 6.1, there it is. Thank you very much. Over to you, Giuseppe.
Great, thank you, Dr. Wilson. Good afternoon, commissioners. What I'll do now is provide you with a brief update on the 5-year biological and ecosystem science research plan, the 2017-2021, which is coming to a close. And as you will remember, from this 5-year biological and ecosystem science research plan, we had 5 primary research areas that are listed here on the left side of this table. The first one being migration, the second one being reproduction, the third one being growth, the fourth one being discard mortality rates and discard survival, and the fifth one being genetics and genomics. In fact, how these 5-year research areas are going to turn into or develop further into the next 5-year research plan, this is something that is currently in development, and it will be touched upon by Dr. Wilson a little later on. What I would like to start with is by stressing the efforts that the IPHC Secretariat has been conducting from input from the Scientific Review Board to establish a solid link between biological research activities and the needs and priorities for stock assessment and management strategy evaluation. So I apologize for this table, but I just want to highlight that in this table, we've compiled the different research areas and the research activities on the right-hand side that you see in colors with the top-ranked priorities for stock assessment. So the top ranks for stock assessment, as you can see in the first column on the left, labeled under SA rank, are 3 top biological input priorities that correspond to research activities conducted within the areas of reproduction, genetics and genomics, and migration. And then also research priorities for stock assessment in relation to assessment data collection and processing that are also related to current research activities in the areas of reproduction and mortality survival assessment. We did also the same for the research priorities for management and strategy evaluation. Here you see the research areas and research activities, again in colors, on the 2 columns on the far right of this table. And on the far left of the table is the ranked MSc priorities that relate to biological parameterization and validation of movement estimates contemplated within research activities conducted in the areas of migration and genetics and genomics. Secondly ranked, biological parameterization and validation of recruitment variability and distribution. These are research activities that are conducted within the areas of genetics and genomics and reproduction currently, and others. So this is just to highlight the efforts that the IPHC Secretary has done in ensuring that all the research activities and that are being conducted are extremely well aligned with the needs of both stock assessment and management strategy evaluation. So following this brief summary of our management implications in terms of the research activities, let me move through some of the highlights of our research program within this last 5-year research plan. And I'll start with the area of migration and distribution. And this is a study that we presented some results in previous IPHC meetings. And this is related to larval and juvenile connectivity studies that are extremely relevant for both stock assessment in terms of improving estimates of productivity, as well as for management strategy evaluation to improve parameterization of the operating model. In this particular study, what we did in collaboration with scientists at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle is to investigate larval connectivity between the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea, as well as connectivity within each of these ocean basins. And one of the key outcomes of this research was that the degree of larval connectivity inferred from model studies on larval trajectories is that the connectivity of larvae between the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea is highly influenced by the spawning location. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see a map of the Gulf of Alaska and a portion of the Bering Sea with 5 spawning regions highlighted in colors. And what you can see is that depending on where the fish are spawned, the percentage of larvae that reach the Bering Sea differs greatly. In the table below the map, you can see that for fish that are modeled to spawn in the Bering Sea in spawning region number 1 in orange, 100% of those larvae actually end up in the Bering Sea. What's interesting is that larvae that are modeled to spawn in spawning regions 2 and 3 in the Gulf of Alaska, those from spawning region 2, more than half of those larvae actually end up in the Bering Sea, demonstrating this high level of connectivity between ocean basins. In addition, what we did was to model the trajectories of these larvae, and that map that you see in the center bottom under January 2009, these are model exercises of larvae that are spawned in January of 2009. And you can see over a period of 3 to 5 months, the model trajectories of these larvae in terms of their spatial distribution. And you can see that after 3 to 5 months, those larvae can potentially reach the Russian waters, basically crossing those transnational boundaries. We also conducted some studies with juvenile Pacific halibut from the Bering Sea, and using Dr. Webster's spacetime model, we determined that the larvae that were potentially spawned in the Bering Sea as well as in the Gulf of Alaska that were occupying nursery areas within the southeastern Bering Sea. The better known area is Bristol Bay. Those larvae over time can actually move back into the Gulf of Alaska. So this study was finally published earlier this year in the Journal of Fisheries Oceanography. The second research area is that of reproduction, and this area has some key research activities that influence both the stock assessment and the management strategy evaluation process. And one is maturity estimations and fecundity assessment. In order to achieve those goals, what the IPHC Secretariat conducted over these last few years, and this is summarized in the next slide, is to conduct studies to better understand the reproductive biology of the species in order to address these issues. For that reason, we conducted studies to understand the seasonal characterization of reproductive development, and this has led to the understanding of key reproductive biological parameters for Pacific halibut, for female Pacific halibut in particular. And one of the key outcomes is the determination that July and August is an appropriate time of gonad collection to conduct the studies that are going to be contemplated within the next 5-year research plan. And those studies are histologically based maturity schedule in order to refine the maturity schedule that Dr. Stewart has presented before. And that will be critical to fine-tune and increase the accuracy of that maturity curve. That will be crucial for estimating the potential contribution of that 2012 year class for the spawning biomass. And these studies are actually contemplated within the 2022 FIS. There's going to be an important biological sample collection taking place in 2022. The second aspect that is contemplated within the next 5-year research plan, and for which we have foundational information from the previous research plan, is fecundity assessment. One of the key outcomes of the studies on the seasonal characterization of reproductive development was the determination of the type of fecundity the female Pacific halibut has. And those studies on fecundity assessment will be beginning in 2023 with the collection of ovaries in our Fisheries Independent Satellite Survey. One of the activities that we're actually currently conducting is the comparison of macroscopic or visual maturity staging that is currently used in our Fisheries Independent Satellite Survey with the microscopic or histologically based maturity staging in order to eventually revise, if needed, the current macroscopic staging criteria that are being used. As a result of these studies, we have published in late 2020 one of the first publications, and now we have a second publication that is in review that covers the seasonal characterization of reproductive development. The third research area is that of growth, and we have several research activities, of which two we could say that we have fully completed, and those are the identification and application of markers for growth pattern evaluation, and to describe possible environmental influences on growth patterns, particularly the effects of temperature. And these are obviously highly relevant for both stock assessment and MSC in terms of scaling the stock productivity and reference point estimates, as well as the improvement of the simulation of variability, and to allow scenarios for investigating climate change within the MSC process. This work initiated as a result of a grant funded by the North Pacific Research Board that finished late last year. This work contemplated the identification of physiological growth markers with which we could actually follow and monitor growth. And this is obviously in relation to better understanding some of the drivers of changes in sizes age. Now we can say that we actually have identified a number of useful physiological growth markers that have been tested in individuals caught in the wild, and that we could say that they are valid physiological growth markers to monitor growth in the Pacific halibut population. So in this summary slide, we're moving now into furthering our studies in terms of the environmental studies, the environmental influences on growth patterns, and potentially also dietary influences on growth patterns and physiological condition. One of the main outcomes so far have been the validation of growth markers to monitor growth, and also to have described the effects of temperature on growth rates and the identification of temperature-specific molecular responses. The fourth research area is that of discard mortality rates and survival assessment, and here we have two main projects. You've heard quite a bit about the first one, our studies related to the directed longline fishery. This was a study that was funded in part by the Saltonstall Kennedy Grant Program. This is a project that the funding finished late last year, but that we're still working on. This project, as you may remember, had as its main objective to link handling events, basically hook release techniques, the resulting injuries, the resulting viabilities, with potential changes in physiological condition, stress levels of those fish, and eventually linking that to survivability. The survivability aspect is finished. In fact, we just published the results of the estimation of discard mortality rates just recently. And we're continually working on establishing the link between handling events and physiological condition and survival in order to estimate or determine which are good predictors of mortality in this longline fishery, and eventually to develop best practices for this fishery. A more recent study related, in fact, quite similar to the one conducted in the longline fishery, is a study that we've been conducting with a guided recreational fishery. This study has received funding from both the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and a grant from the North Pacific Research Board. And we have collaborators that include the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska Pacific University, and Alaska Charter Association. In this study, we're now on the second phase of this study, and we were lucky enough that in spring of this year, of 2021, we were able to finally conduct the experimental field work. We conducted studies in two areas, in Sitka, IPHC Regulatory Area 2C, between 21st and 27th of May, and we captured 243 Pacific halibut in total from several size classes, using and establishing the comparison between two gear types, 12-aught and 16-aught hooks. And we collected a number of observations and samples that range from the hooking time, the time on deck, obviously the hook injury type and viability, weight, length, and blood samples for stress analysis, and wire tagging for all of this fish. The second study was conducted in IPHC Regulatory Area 3A out of Seward in Alaska between 11th and 17th of June of the same year, just a few months ago. And in this study, we collected a total of 118 fish, 80 of which were actually tagged with accelerometer tags that will allow us to estimate discard mortality rates from those fish. So those studies are still in progress, and we hope in a few months to be able to provide a full report on the outcome. This is a summary slide that summarizes all the activities conducted within this 5-year research plan related to this research area. On top, you have the discard mortality rate estimation. The portion that we're continuing to work on is the estimation of the best handling practices in this longline fishery, as you can see. And in the bottom, we still are conducting a lot of the determinations and studies related to estimating discard mortality rate in the charter recreational fishery. The last research area is that of genetics and genomics, and here we have two main research activities contemplated within this research area that have that are highly relevant for both stock assessment and the MSC process, and those are related to the delineation of population structure and the better understanding of distribution of Pacific halibut using genomic tools. The main specific objectives are really to revise our understanding of genetic structure of the Pacific halibut population and focusing on the population structure in IPHC Regulatory Area 4B. In Regulatory Area 4B, we're lucky enough in 2020 to collect winter samples on either side of Amchichka Pass. With this genetic samples, we're going to be able to embark in a comprehensive study refining the fine population structure. This is possible because of the work that the IPHC Secretariat conducted in sequencing the Pacific halibut genome. The techniques that we're going to be using to conduct this population genomics analysis are genome-based, obviously, and include low-coverage whole genome resequencing strategies. So in this summary slide, we could see that on the far right, and that's one of the key research areas that are going to be contemplated within the next 5 years research plan, is to conduct these population genomic studies in order to establish a baseline of genetic diversity and delineate fine-scale stock structure with particular emphasis in IPHC Regulatory Area 4B. And for this study, I'm happy to say that we just recently received funding from the North Pacific Research Board in order to conduct these studies. So collaborative research has been an important component within this 5 year research plan, and I'm here just highlighting 4 projects that have been active within the last year, and those are the top 2 are the grants from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and North Pacific Board funding the recreational discard mortality rate study. We have also a new project that just started this month that is funded by the bycatch reduction engineering program, NOAA, that is related to whale depredation. And then on the 4th and last line, we have this new project from the North Pacific Research Board that will hopefully start February 1st, 2022, on Pacific halibut population genomics. And that closes my presentation. Thank you.
Chair, that might be a sensible approach. The next presentation will be relatively short, and so if paper for the 5-year plan could be brought up, just paper 12, please. Paper 12, please. Okay, well, thank you, Chair. So paper 12 is, the purpose is to provide you with the current draft of the IPHC's 5-year program of integrated research and monitoring, running from 2022 roughly through to 2026. The document remains in development, and that's probably the way it's going to stay for some time, as we've chosen to take a living document approach rather than a static 5-year program of integrated research. And there's a number of reasons for that, is that we're still working through how to integrate all of the various research streams and monitoring streams that we undertake at the Secretariat into a single cohesive document, and this is likely to take a little bit more time. We're also taking on board constant feedback and improvements from the Scientific Review Board and from other sources. For example, at the most recent 19th session of the Scientific Review Board, the SRB has provided approximately 8 additional areas for improvement. Everything from enhancing the stock assessment section to reflect research in this area, through to including the intent for the management strategy evaluation to provide research direction and prioritization feedback, through to also discussions around what we would do in relation to adding climate change as one of our research or monitoring streams. The plan itself, as an overarching goal, is to, as Dr. Planas has just pointed out, build upon the biological and ecosystem science research plan, 5-year plan, which is nearing its completion, and really integrate that across not only research, but also our monitoring streams, such as fisheries data collection coastwide, and also the annual monitoring through the Fishery Independent Setline Survey. The idea there, of course, is to promote integration and synergies across the various research and support activities that we undertake at the Secretariat, and to improve our knowledge of key inputs into the Pacific halibut stock assessment, the management strategy evaluation work that Dr. Hicks is undertaking, any economic work that the Commission may wish us to undertake, and also to enhance our annual monitoring streams. So through the port sampling program, the commercial fisheries data monitoring, and also through our Fisheries Independent Setline Survey. At this point, we expect to spend quite a significant amount of work. If you do peruse this document, you'll see that there are still a number of sections that require substantial additions, everything from including the range of recommendations that have arisen from the Scientific Review Board, not only at its most recent meeting, but also over the past number of years. We're also going to weave in the performance review, the second performance review recommendations relating to science, research, and monitoring. And then also, as time permits, enhance areas such as how we're going to communicate the research, how we're going to communicate it to stakeholders and more broadly to the scientific community. So to sort of summarize, there's still a substantial amount of work that we're going to be undertaking over the next number of months. But to reiterate again, is the intent is not to have a static 5-year research plan. We don't envision embarking upon this plan come early next year and have it as a rigid program for 5 years, but rather depending on the changing needs of the Commission, the recommendations and requests of the Commission itself, as well as the identified data needs for both the stock assessment, but also the management strategy evaluation that's ongoing, make those modifications and redirections in almost real time, thereby providing us hopefully with a much more nimble and usable research program, monitoring program for the Commission. And so with that, Chair, I'll wrap up and happy to take any questions initially from commissioners and at the same time checking to see if there's any stakeholder comment. Thank you, Chair.
Any consideration to sort of strategic planning on the science and research side beyond a 5-year time horizon? I guess I'm thinking about the number of years it takes to complete many projects and what it might take to assemble resources to be able to deliver and just kind of defining a broader set of priorities that might look a bit further into the future.
Thank you. Through the chair. In short, yes, and it's one of the reasons why we're leaning towards having sort of a living document more so than a static 5-year plan. Not only does that allow you to have a constant minimum outlook of 5 years, but as you say, to look even further forward. Have we mapped out 10 years or any of those sorts of time periods? The answer is no, not at this point, but that's the intention. It's the idea is as we put together our timelines of our current 5-year plan, once we have an approximation of how that would be strung together, it'll give us a better ability to be able to plan even further ahead. And particularly, that would be particularly relevant if we were to embark upon climate change research and similar fields. The management strategy evaluation work is also an area where we can start to look further afield than sort of this standardized 5-year period that many organizations use. I think that's, I don't know, Dr. Plantis, if you have anything else to add there from the biological ecosystem science side as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Yeah, I completely agree. I think the initial 5-year term for the first 5-year research plan was actually, it served its purpose in establishing a number of exploratory projects that are now leading its fruits. And we may see that, as Dr. Wilson pointed out, the living document of the next research integrated plan will also allow for considering moving some of the research projects into long-term monitoring. And that's that one of the key examples has been the genetic determination of the sex ratios from the commercial landings. We may find that, also in relation to possible changes in response to climate change, that we may want to monitor changes in other biological parameters, such as maturity or fecundity over time, or growth related to possible changes in size at age as well. Thank you.
Sorry, Chair. No public comment or questions at this point. And I'll to comment on time.
Thanks, Commissioner Merrill. Presentation on the management strategy evaluation should be about 25 to 30 minutes, depending how fast I talk. I'll leave it up to you. We have a break scheduled for 3:30. If I talk fast, we might break right then before questions. Sure, no problem. I'll talk clearly and succinctly. Okay, I'll present a little bit here on the update of the management strategy evaluation, the work that's been done in the last year, and some outcomes of some meetings. But before I do that, I want to just give a really brief background to refresh all of our memories and define a few terms like MSE framework. So for example, here we have an illustration of the MSE framework, which consists of basically an operating model on the left and then a management procedure on the right. And so many different elements of these is what, of this framework is what I'll be talking about today. And they're the components or the elements of the management strategy evaluation, things that are in development and things that will be improved. For example, in the operating model, which simulates the population, many aspects of there are under development and improvement. And then the management procedure, which is the parts that we do or can control in our management process or decide to control. That is really the main interest here, is evaluating management procedures. The current interim harvest strategy policy is basically our current paradigm that we're operating under. And Dr. Stewart described this earlier and actually put numbers to it. I think about this more in an abstract sense, you might think, and different ways to put numbers through this machine. But there's many different elements that, that we've been investigating and changing. So for example, we have a scale component which operates at the coast-wide level. And then we have a TCY distribution component, which operates at the regulatory area level or possibly the biological region level. And there's many different elements in here, such as fishing intensity, the F43%, the control rule. In the distribution, there's various elements, such as the current agreements in place, stock distribution estimated from the survey, et cetera. But the key here is that we experiment with these different elements, put it through this procedure, and see which management procedure performs best, which combination of these elements performs best, given the performance metrics and objectives that have been defined. And then I want to draw your attention to this decision-making step at the very end, and that basically is the annual meeting where the mortality limits or those TCYs will be decided by the commission. And that's a very important step in this harvest strategy policy, one we certainly don't want to ignore as part of the process and how the final mortality limits are decided. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. And then finally, just a little bit of review here that we investigated 11 different management procedures that were reported at the last annual meeting and results from those, noting that 2 of the better performing management procedures defined by our objectives were management procedure D, which had this sort of allowance to increase fishing intensity to allow for the various agreements, which are seen down here in the green. And those are the current agreements in place. And then MPJ, which really differed from the other management procedures by smoothing or having a 5-year moving average of the 032 stock distribution as estimated from the FIS data. So in other words, instead of reacting based on just the most recent year distribution, that variability seemed to be reduced by providing a 5-year moving average. So we had a meeting earlier this year, the 11th special session of the IPHC, and that is where we presented a number of different MSC-related tasks that could be done in the next program of work, and the Commission prioritized that into a smaller set of MSC tasks for completion and presentation at the annual meeting 99 in 2023. And so here's a table of those prioritized tasks. And I note at the top right is a link to the actual program of work document that's posted on the IPHC website. But I note here are 4 tasks related to the framework, such as investigating migration, implementation variability. I'll talk about those 2 specifically. And then also improving simulations of the assessment or the estimation error model. And then finally, developing alternative operating models to represent the uncertainty that we have in the system. Those are currently undergoing, and we'll be reporting more on those at the annual meeting, but I'll provide a quick update here at the end of this presentation. Related to management procedures, 2 priorities from the Commission were to look at size limits and multi-year assessments, where size limits would be investigating changing that 32-inch size limit. What's the effect of that in terms of the MSC long-term effects? And then also investigating multi-year assessments, which means not doing an assessment specifically every year, but having that assessment, say, done every other year, every 3rd year, allowing time for more research and development of the assessment model, etc. And then finally, which I completely agree with, is presentation of results and evaluation is a very important concept that we need to work on to translate these MSC results to the Commission, the stakeholders, the various advisory bodies, so that they can understand it and they can understand the outcomes and make the best decisions possible. So related to one of the tasks, F1, I'm calling it, is migration scenarios. And this is basically improving how the operating model treats movement, improving those estimates of movement in there. But it also is a matter of defining plausible hypotheses of migration so that we can characterize the range of uncertainty we have in the movement of Pacific halibut throughout the system. And one of the outcomes of this are defining or developing multiple scenarios, which will help us evaluate the robustness of management procedures. And noting that developing those multiple scenarios is part of task F5, which is developing alternative operating models. So that's sort of the relationship between some of these tasks. Part of that task that has been completed at this time is investigating time-varying recruitment distribution. And that is basically how are those age 0 fish distributed every year. And what we were assuming in the previous operating model was that that distribution was the same every year. Halibut got together wherever they spawn, they did their spawning, they released eggs, and then the same proportion went to each biological region every year. That's probably unrealistic, especially given the research that's recently been published by IPHC staff, Laurie Sidoris and Dr. Ray Webster. And they found that cold years have likely have less dispersal to the west. So what we did here was introduce these proportions that are distributed to each of these biological regions are dependent on the PDO being defined as in the stock assessment as a cold year or a warm year. And to make a long story short, what we found is that in the MSE, conditioning the operating model, we basically found similar results to what the Sidoris paper had reported, in that there's more, in a warm PDO year, there's more distribution out into the western areas like 4 and 4B. And the key here is that you have to put the H0 fish in the right place so that they can move appropriately. Otherwise, your whole migration model is going to be off. So you got to start in the right place. Another task that we've been working quite a bit on is defining implementation variability and uncertainty. And so to define first for you is what implementation variability is that's the deviation of the fishing mortality from the mortality limit that is determined from the management procedure itself. So that is, at the end of the day, the boats go out, there's some amount of fishing mortality or whatever's landed and suffers mortality in the water, and that's not going to be exactly what the management procedure specified for that year. We expect there to be that variability. But what we did is we subdivided implementation variability into 4 different elements, and they're actually line up with the framework here, as you can see. So I'm going to start here at the bottom right, and this is the MP mortality, or the management procedure mortality. That is the mortality limits that are specified from the management procedure. That's a reproducible procedure that would produce the same limit every time. This is exactly what Dr. Stewart presented earlier today when he was talking about reference, I think it was called reference mortality limits. Then you have what's called the adopted mortality limits, and that's the decision that the commission made, and Dr. Stewart also presented those for past years as well. And those are the mortality limits that are set into regulation. That's passed into the fisheries go out and fish, and I tell you, they're really good at getting close to those limits, but they don't do it exactly every year. We had that discussion earlier. Sometimes they're a little bit under, sometimes they're a little bit above, and that's what's called the actual fishing mortality. The problem is we're really good at knowing or estimating that actual mortality, but we don't always get that exactly right either. So then we have what is called the estimated mortality, and that's the mortality we estimate from the fishery. Sometimes that can be really good, especially when we determine it from landings. Sometimes it might be a little bit off or a little bit more uncertain when we're estimating it from, say, observer coverage. So within the implementation variability, we've defined this decision-making variability, and that's the difference between those MP mortality limits and the adopted mortality limits set by the commission. And so this is a type of implementation variability that will simulate in the operating model. Furthermore, the difference between those adopted and actual fishing mortality down here is what we call realized. And then the difference between that actual fishing mortality and the estimated fishing mortality is perceived. Sometimes that's determined in different ways, either from what they've observed on the water or just from some past observations. But the key here is how are we going to define and simulate decision-making variability in the operating model? So the first thing we did was look in the past at what have been the decisions and how have those decisions varied from the management procedure. This isn't ideal because we don't actually know if that past is consistent with the future, but it's what we have, and it can give us a good idea of how to characterize this. So here at the bottom is an equation. I always like to throw equations into my presentations. think it tries to make me look smart. But we have what we, here is the management procedure TCY, that's coming out of the management procedure. And then we have some multiplier on that, that then determines the adopted TCY, what the commission might decide on. And so if that multiplier was 1, that means the commission adopted exactly what the management procedure specified. If it's above, it's greater than the management procedure. If it's below 1, it's less than. And you can see in the plot over the last, I think it's 8 years here, is what those multipliers have been for each IPHC regulatory area. And I want to note, I do realize that things like 2A, they've had the agreements in place for the last 2 years, so that you see those points there are right as a multiplier of 1, because the management procedure then specified an agreement of 1.65 million pounds, and that was what was adopted by the commission. So we do have to take into account the management procedure and how the implementation variability differs with management procedures. But this is a look at the past, and we can look at the past to then define how to simulate this into the future. And so what we've proposed here in simulation is to simulate differing multipliers, or how that variability would be applied across different TCYs. So as the management procedure TCY gets greater, the commission may be less likely to exceed in their decision making, exceed that management procedure TCY. And this came out of a lot of discussions with the SRB and how to do this, and this is the method that we came up with. Noting also that as the TCY is smaller, the variability on that multiplier is greater too. So they may not exceed the TCY, or they may set it less, or they may set it quite a bit greater. And these distributions are determined from the look at the past variability. So that was decision-making variability, and there's other types, sorry about that, of implementation uncertainty in the model. Realized uncertainty is already being simulated in the OM and has been, and then perceived uncertainty is currently not simulated. That is something we're thinking about and going to determine how useful it will be to include. So that brings us then to the management procedures part of the program of work. And again, in a review, this is size limits, investigating the various size limits and maybe accounting for how markets may react, such as was done in the previous size limit paper presented at the last annual meeting. It was noted that yield could increase, but if there was a price differential for those U32 fish, that could actually mean a decline in the economic output of the fisheries. And then the second management procedure category that we plan to investigate in the program of work are multi-year assessments. And here is really a consideration of what stability means. That's really important to consider, and I'll talk briefly about that, show you some results. So with size limits, if you recall, we've had this discussion before. What will it take to investigate size limits in the MSE? And I have noted in the past in presentations and answering questions that it can be quite a big project if we want to do it, you know, in a really inclusive way or a complete way of trying to integrate length and weight and age and all that other stuff. But in the interest of time, and that there isn't much time leading up to the 99th annual meeting, there is a shorter way up here where you model those length processes independently, and they're not linked specifically to population processes. It's an approximation, but it's a useful approximation. So what the Secretariat is proposing is to do this for now, and to model these length processes independently, and be able to do this, investigate some size limit management procedures as well as other aspects of the current program of work. Related to the multi-year assessments, we've already done some investigation of that, and I have some results from the last round of the MSE simulations to report here. Noting we had MPA on the left there is basically the current interim management procedure without the agreements. So without, or, oh no, it does have the agreements. What it did not have is any sort of constraint on the coastwide level TCY. So MPA is the closest management procedure we have to the current interim management procedure, and we simulated that last time. MPA2 is simulating that with a biennial assessment where the mortality limit was set for a 2-year period. It was constant between those 2 years. And we'll see how that affects it. I've included here for reference just those other 2 management procedures, but I will not report the results on them. So here's where you really can see how this management procedures, how these work. And these are called trace plots or simulated trajectories, where we have years along the horizontal or x-axis, and then the actual TCY in this plot on the y-axis. And in blue is that management procedure A, which is mimicking our current interim management procedure. And you can see it's smooth, so every year the TCY is adopted or changed by the management procedure. You can see a couple of weird departures here. That could be like a control rule kicking in or something like that, something with estimation error. But really contrasting that with the red, you see the step function where every 2 years is when the mortality limits are changing. They show a little bit of differences, especially early on in these. The red seems to have a little bit more difficult time getting started up. But the MSE, the real important part, is looking at the objectives and the performance metrics related to those objectives. And so what you can see here is comparing MPA to MPA2, MPA2 is in purple. You can see a lot of the performance metrics are similar, but overall there's slightly improved stability. If you look at this probability that any 3 years out of 10 have a TCY that changes by more than 15%. So out of a 10-year period, any of those 3 years or more change by more than 15%. You can see a smaller proportion right here, 0.36, compared to just MPA. So that implies improved stability, but at the cost of a slight decline in the average TCY over a 10-year period. And so those are the trade-offs with an MSE. But what we have had discussions with the MSAB about is that, you know, what does stability mean? And it might be useful to reopen this discussion a little bit, because if we define the metrics slightly different, so for example, any 1 year has a change of the TCY by more than 15%, you can see that the biennial assessments are actually a greater probability that any 1 year will have a change in the TCY more than 15%. And also any 2 years, but any 3 years it doesn't. And that's because you're now defining stability over a period where you know that it's going to be stable over a 2-year period. And so 5 out of those 10 years cannot actually change the TCY. So it's a different concept, something to think about, but I think we'll be able to communicate those results quite well when we figure out what is desired. So really on the multi-year assessment, what we've learned so far is there's trade-offs between the annual changes and what multi-year stability might mean to different stakeholders in the commission. But also we've been thinking about that fixing that TCY for 2 or more years really ignores incoming data streams. And that might be a concern. So for example, if the TCY was fixed last year and it couldn't change this year, I'm sure with that survey result in 3B, there might be some comments about that. So what are some extensions to the multi-year assessment MP that we can investigate over the next year? And that are, you know, extending that period of time between assessments, even up to quinquennial, which is a new word for me, and I wanted to make sure I got it in this presentation. But we also, you know, we're very interested in some empirical approaches in those non-assessment years. So for example, if last year was an assessment year and we were not doing an assessment this year, maybe we can still use the survey results in some way to adjust the TCY in the interim period while we still have the opportunity to research assessment and free up our time for other sources of research. So there's a number of different ideas that we can do in those non-assessment years, and we've been thinking about those. So that brings me to the end right at 3:30. I hope that wasn't too fast, but I got all my points across, and I just want to summarize this up here, noting that there's the paper 13, noting that implementation uncertainty will be incorporated to evaluate the robustness of management procedures and possibly departing from that management procedure mortality limit. Notifying that a simplified approach will be used for investigating size limits within the MSE framework, and that allows us to complete the program of work. And also the elements of the management procedures related to multi-year assessments may include other elements. So there's many other things like holding the TCY constant or introducing some way in a non-assessment year to change that mortality limit. And that's just part of the management procedure. But finally, I want to note that we have not had a specific interactive MSAB meeting in 2021. However, on November 10th, we had an informational meeting with MSAB members, and I believe 2 commissioners as well as members of the public. It was a very useful meeting for me, and I hope others found it useful. It allowed me to practice my presentation for one, but I got some feedback on what people have been thinking. And so we asked the commission to consider and potentially adopt a 2022 schedule for the MSAB. Potentially a meeting in May and then a meeting in October is what has been traditional in the past. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'll take any questions whenever it's convenient. I can just leave this slide up.
Hi, Alan. Thank you very much for your presentation. Just looking at E on your recommendations, I didn't see the, do you have a recommended from the MSAB a schedule that they would like to pursue, or is that for us to develop? Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner DeGrief. No, I have not heard any recommendations from MSAB members on a proposed schedule, and I do believe that is up to the commission to decide. Personally, I don't have a recommendation myself either, other than it is useful, I think, when we're coming up in this next year to maybe have at least an information session. I thought that was useful for people to be aware of what the results are. You might notice that there are some decisions that could be made in defining elements of those management procedures, like in point D here. And the MSAB could definitely assist with that. What has typically happened in past MSAB meetings is that May meeting is more of a meeting to help develop the management procedures, objectives if we're reopening that topic, and then provide direction from the MSAB to the Secretariat, and then come back in October, and the MSAB has a chance to preview any results and look at outcomes, help with evaluation and interpretation, and to provide any recommendations to the Commission at the October meeting. So if I was to foresee a potential schedule for 2022, I'd see a short May meeting just for everybody to become familiar with the concepts and maybe develop, just verify and develop a few management procedures after direction from the Commission at the annual meeting, of course. And then in that October meeting to just review any simulation results, help the Secretariat in ways they can present those results, And then the MSAB members, as well as other stakeholders, are already familiar with the outcomes of the MSE and can be a little bit more ready at the annual meeting.
It seems like it's helpful to have MSAB engaged. So.
Thanks, Chair. We'll just take a moment to check. No, Chair. There's currently no public comments or questions. Thank you.
Is that correct? So perhaps given that, Dr. Wilson, as well as the interest, I think, to revisit some of the issues regarding the FIS survey design, perhaps we could start with the FIS survey design conversation in the morning tomorrow, and then move into agenda.
Thanks, Chair. That makes a lot of sense.
We can reconvene virtually in via the link that you've been provided at call that 2:45 Alaska or 3:45 Pacific time. And I believe a number of us have a hard stop at 5 p.m. Alaska or 6 p.m. Pacific.
Just to
I think with that, we are concluded.
So, Dave, we will get some update on.
Thank you, everyone.
FIS survey between option 1 and 2 as far as what the benefits and costs are between the two options. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess just be clear, there's between option 1 and 2, there's a difference of 157.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, we can represent briefly what Dr. Stewart provided and then provide any additional detail you may wish to hear about.
Areas. Thanks. And I think we heard today that both option 1 and 2 have a net deficit of 200,000, both options. But I think we need that kind of information just to see it documented so we both are all on the same page. Thanks.
Yeah, yes,
Thank
Chair,
you.
we can certainly do that.
Any other comments concerning either the agenda, remaining agenda today or tomorrow? Okay, seeing none. Thank you everyone for your time, and for US stakeholders, we'll see you shortly in our virtual room. Thanks again.